Kinch, the author of Between Hope and Fear, A History of Vaccines and Human Immunity. Mr. Kinch is a professor and associate vice chancellor at Washington University in St. Louis. Beyond his current work documenting the sources of innovation responsible for new medicines, he has led cancer research activities at the biotechnology company MedImmune and the development of medicines to prevent pandemic virus outbreaks at Functional Genetics. He's also the author of two other books, The End of the Beginning, Cancer Immunity and the Future of a Cure, and A Prescription for Change, The Looming Crisis in Drug Development. Please give a warm virtual welcome to Michael Kinch.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here and to talk about a subject that is sadly very much part of our lives today. But on the other hand, it's a great subject to talk about because there are many questions. And so with that in mind, I'm actually going to speak a little less than I normally would in order to hopefully field a lot of questions that are out there. And the subject of this talk is obviously going to be vaccines. And what I'd like to do is to present an overview of how vaccines basically were first discovered, how they've been deployed, some of the problems that have been associated with them, and really talk about all of this in the context of what's happening quite literally today with the COVID-19 outbreak. So with that in mind, we'll sort of get started and talk about vaccines and the issues that are behind them. So if we look in the not too terribly distant past, what we can see is that if you look at, and this happens to be the City of London, which has done a good job collecting information about mortality, what they found was that smallpox deaths from the times that they began recording, which was in the mid-17th century, and through the year 1800, the number of smallpox deaths often exceeded 100 deaths per 1,000 people. And in its peak years, 180, 190 per 1,000 people. Now, that's an enormous number. And to put that into perspective, and not to minimize in any way what's going on right now, in the United States, we're experiencing 158 deaths per 100,000 people. And so 170 deaths per 1,000 is quite literally 100-fold more death. And this was what they were receiving on an annual basis from one disease, and that disease is smallpox. And it's been argued that probably smallpox has killed more members of our species, of more humans, than any other virus and any other pathogen in history. It's an amazing disease, the amazingly horrible disease that thankfully we've largely forgotten. And that forgetfulness is actually part of the reason why I wrote this book a few years ago, because we really have to remember infectious diseases. And frankly, part of the reason for writing this book has now gone away, because I don't think we're going to forget about infectious diseases for at least a generation or two, given what has happened since the beginning of 2020. But again, this puts into perspective the fact that you have always had against, fighting humans, if you will, viruses and bacteria, pathogenic viruses and bacteria. And frankly, if you think about it, viruses are at the top of the food chain. We'd like to think that we're at the top of the food chain, that we harvest, be it crops of plants or animals, but frankly, we are not. Viruses harvest us. And so we tend to be the food, and there are famines and everything else that viruses suffer that are very much akin to how we deal with food collection. Now, if you notice past 1800, you don't see this massive death coming from smallpox. And the question, of course, is why? And the answer to that, as I'm sure you're aware, are vaccines. And it turns out that vaccines were not the first way that we used to target smallpox. This was such a deadly disease. So many people, such a large fraction of people who would get the disease would die, that people were willing to self-administer, if you will, smallpox. And this was a process known as variolation. And variolation was basically the idea that you would take a bit of active smallpox virus, which came from a pustule from someone who actually had smallpox, and you would intentionally put it under the skin in a particular way, put it on the arm or sometimes the leg of a volunteer, with the idea of something happening in the body. And at this time, they didn't know what immunology was. They didn't know about the immune system, but they did know that the people that suffered this intentional disease through variolation tended to survive when smallpox would come through their city. Now, we think of this as an arcane process today, and it is, frankly, a surprisingly large number of people died from variolation. The number varies, but it could be as high as 1%. So 1 out of 100 people that were variolated got such a terrible disease that they died. But that was great, or preferable at least, to the numbers that we saw before, which would occur if you had a natural infection. So 1 out of 100 was considered pretty good chance compared to this, at least according to some people. So we basically saw variolation enter the Europe from Asia. It had been practiced in China probably going back to the 13th or 14th century. It worked its way along the Silk Road into the Middle East, whereas in China, they tended to blow these smallpox scabs up the nose. The process turned into this cut underneath the skin, probably arising from Sudan and remaining in the Middle East area. And it was introduced into Europe by an amazing woman by the name of Lady Montagu, who was the wife of the ambassador to the Ottoman Empire. So she was British. Her husband was the British representative of the crown to the Ottoman Empire. And she heard about variolation. She had a son who was the ambassador's son. And she convinced the doctor of the embassy in what is today Istanbul to variolate her son. And she further told the doctor that he couldn't tell the ambassador. Now, this did not make the ambassador terribly happy. He was caught between a rock and a hard place, because Lady Montagu, who herself had had smallpox and barely survived just a few years before, she knew how terrible this disease could be, and she was determined that her children were not going to suffer the same fate. So the doctor variolated her son. It was successful. He did get sick, but he survived, and he was protected from smallpox for the rest of his life, it turns out. And later they had their daughter variolated when they were back in England, and they did this in front of a number of people from the Royal Society of Medicine. And as a consequence of this, variolation became a procedure that was done fairly routinely in Europe. As a matter of fact, you would oftentimes schedule your summer vacation to go to a variolation camp, where you would then get sick as a dog for a few weeks with smallpox. And assuming that you survived, and we would like to think that less than 1% of people dying is a good thing. Assuming that you survived, you were then protected against smallpox. This was how bad the situation was that Lady Montagu was facing. And there was a resistance to variolation because, unsurprisingly, any procedure you do on a healthy person that causes 1% of the people to die, at least, that's problematic. And it was likewise opposed in the early colonies, and the most progressive figure espousing variolation was Cotton Mather. And if that name sounds familiar, he was one of the Puritans who basically was responsible for the Salem witch trials and for the mindset behind that. But he, comparatively speaking, was considered to be a progressive in his day, and he supported variolation. So it was not a terribly big jump from variolation to what's known as inoculation, or what we would today call vaccination. And that's because what happened, and the conventional story that we've all heard, or at least those of us who know about vaccines have heard, is that in the mid-1790s, a guy named Edward Jenner, who was an English doctor, noticed that milkmaids had this very clean skin, very pure skin, and it was clean in that it was free from smallpox scars. And even today, some of beauty products say, skin as smooth as milk. Well, that milk and milkmaid association with smooth skin goes back to hundreds and hundreds of years. And the story goes that Jenner realized, oh, this must be, the skin must be pure and non-scarred because the milkmaids suffered from a disease called cowpox. And in the picture, you can actually see an udder of a cow over here, in which there is an open lesion. And so the story goes that Jenner took basically material from the cowpox lesion and did the same thing as variolation, but did this with cowpox. And that the consequence was that, first of all, people were protected from smallpox. And second of all, you didn't have these high death rates that were associated with variolation. It's a great story. It's not true. Edward Jenner did popularize this, but it turns out that a couple decades before Jenner, there was a doctor by the name of Benjamin Jesty, and the story I just told you is exactly the case, where Benjamin Jesty, who was a dairy farmer, put two and two together, realized milkmaids didn't suffer from smallpox, and he actually walked with his wife and children when there was a smallpox outbreak that was in the neighboring village. He walked for miles and miles until he found a cow with cowpox. He then performed a procedure of variolation because he had been variolated when he was a kid, and he recalled it from memory, and he used his wife's knitting needles. And he variolated, or in this case, vaccinated, because vaca is from cow. So he used cowpox, which is where we get the word vaccine. He utilized his wife's knitting needles, variolated his children and his wife with the cowpox, and basically was the first to show that this worked. However, his wife became infected because her dirty knitting needles caused an infection when he was variolating her. She told the local doctor, and the doctor, apparently not realizing there were HIPAA laws, told everyone in the village about this. And the Jestys were run out of town. And they were run out of town because the villagers sincerely thought that the Jestys were going to turn into a minotaur-like creature and go rampaging through the village and kill people. So they eventually were run out of town. And it turns out that this was one of the first evidences of anti-vaccine movements. And if you consider the opposition to variolation, you can argue that the anti-vaccine movement actually predates vaccines themselves. So we went from, in the late 1700s, being able to go from variolation to vaccination, to using cowpox, which was incredibly safe, to starting to eliminate this disease altogether. And if we just very briefly go through the timeline, it turns out that in the 1840s, the idea of vaccination with cowpox had become so popular that in 1840, the British government mandated it. Everyone had to be vaccinated. That soon, actually, the same occurred in the United States, but because the federal government generally cannot mandate a health measure, that falls to the responsibility of individual states. One by one, the states tended to adopt this until by the time of the Civil War, pretty much everybody was requiring vaccination. And more importantly, they were outlawing variolation, because variolation, again, had a terrible death rate and an unnecessary death rate when you had a very safe alternative. Now, flash forward a century, and as part of the Cold War, the United States decided it was going to make friends in Latin America by getting everyone in Latin America, everyone in the Western Hemisphere, to be vaccinated for smallpox and eliminate it in this hemisphere. And it was successful. And throughout the 1950s, that was a big push. And this was frankly a part of the Cold War where we were kind of one-upping the Soviets and making Latin American countries feel more fondly towards the United States. Well, by the 1960s, there was a bit of an arms race going on for smallpox between the Soviets and the Americans. And to make a very long story short, and I go through the details of it because it's a fun and interesting story, it turns out that the World Health Organization, which is part of the United Nations, basically directed a few Americans, which are shown here, to lead a program to try to eradicate smallpox globally by vaccinating every single person on the planet. And the last known case of smallpox natural smallpox occurred in 1975, and you can actually see Rahim Banu here. And Rahima actually survived. He was okay, but he was the last known natural cause of smallpox. There were some unnatural causes, meaning they happened in the laboratories, but this was the last case of smallpox, and we eliminated this disease that had so terribly haunted humans for most of history. Well, there are other diseases. So smallpox inspired a lot of terror throughout centuries and millennia. There are other diseases that have similarly sparked terror. And when I would give this same talk 2 or 3 years ago, people didn't understand that infectious diseases were really something that could inspire amazing terror. I don't think I'm going to have that problem, sadly, moving forward. Polio is an example, and there are probably many people in the audience that are listening to this that recall or heard about the terrors of polio. And the most famous case of polio is probably a person who didn't have it. which is that we think of Franklin Delano Roosevelt as being the canonical polio patient. But it turns out FDR probably didn't actually have polio. His disease was probably caused, and his paralysis was probably caused by something known as Guillain-Barré syndrome, which was unrelated to polio. But it turns out it was kind of a good thing that not a good thing for him, but it was a good thing for society that he was associated with polio, because he was able to help stimulate organizations such as the March of Dimes and to help push for a vaccine for polio. Now, a lot of famous people had polio that you probably didn't realize. The Andrew Wyeth painting down here on the bottom left, the Christina on whom this is based, she was suffering from polio. Alan Alda, the famous star from MASH, the science fiction writer Arthur C. Clarke, and Itzhak Perlman, the violinist. All of these folks had suffered from polio and a lot of the problems that polio caused when they were children. Now, if we had more time and during the questions, I'm happy to talk about it, but it turns out that polio is a disease of sanitized societies. If infants are exposed to polio virus, which they were for most of human history, it was a very minor, trivial disease. But if you encounter polio later in life, it can be devastating. FDR would be the prototype if it had been polio, in that if you're in your 20s or 30s, the paralysis can either shut down your lungs, shut down your legs, your arms, and be fatal. And polio used to cause amazing amounts of terror all throughout the world. And this terror is evidenced by various newspaper clippings from the 1940s and 50s, where entire cities would go under quarantine. And this tended to occur. Polio is a summer disease. So in the summertime, there was always a fear, and somehow polio became associated with water, such that even children were told not to play in puddles of water right after a rain, and which probably wasn't, didn't make a whole lot of sense. But basically polio could shut down a community in the same way that in 2020, we've been shut down internationally, not just city-wise. But polio, this fear that was associated with it, is something that we can today appreciate. Well, that fear went away as a result of essentially one very high-profile individual, who was Jonas Salk, who's shown here in the top left picture. And Salk, he had been involved in the influenza vaccine. And again, I'm happy to talk about that. And there were some good things and frankly, some controversies associated with Salk's involvement in that. But what happened was that Salk became backed by the March of Dimes and got a lot of attention put on him. And that attention was because he said, I think I can develop a vaccine for polio. And the entire world started watching this. There were, if you go online, you can see pictures of parents with children waiting in line to participate in the clinical trial for the vaccine, not just to get the vaccine, but to participate in the clinical trial. The clinical testing started in the closing months of the Korean War. And in 2 years later, Salk reported the activity of this. And this was done in a national radio address that was carried by every single station, was listened to by most Americans who were alive at the time. And after he announced that he had developed a successful polio vaccine, the church bells all throughout the United States started to be rung. And it was an amazing, for those who were there, it was an amazing situation that really doesn't have a parallel in today's world, even among COVID. That occurred again in 1955, in the early months of 1955, and that happiness continued while people were getting in line to be able to have their children vaccinated against polio. But unfortunately, the glee and the happiness only lasted a few months, because late in 1955, or in mid to late 1955, there was a company called Cutter Laboratories, which it turns out the Salk vaccine, to go into a little bit of the science, is what we call a killed vaccine. It's the polio virus that had been isolated and purified and then killed with a chemical, with a series of chemicals, essentially similar to formaldehyde, if you're familiar with formaldehyde. Well, Cutter Laboratories was one of 5 companies that was asked to distribute polio vaccine in the United States. So the federal government basically assigned the polio vaccine to one of 5 companies. The West Coast was primarily given to Cutter Laboratories. And in something that occurred that they frankly, to my knowledge, still don't know how it happened today, their batch of polio virus that had been isolated was not fully inactivated. And the consequence was that they injected virus that was capable of causing disease into hundreds of children. And at least 200 cases of kids with paralysis, at least 10 children died. Everything stopped. There was no more polio vaccine distribution, even though the other companies had managed to continue working well and didn't have this problem. The concerns about the safety stopped. It stopped all further vaccination. That would be comparable today to suddenly deciding, nope, we're going to stop immunizing for COVID-19 because something happened. And people were scared. They were particularly scared if they had a child that had been vaccinated and they didn't know if it was part of the good vaccine or the bad vaccine. There was a lot of fear. Salk's enemies pounced. It turns out he wasn't a particularly nice person. And someone from the other side of the state, the part of Ohio that I happen to be from, by the name of Albert Sabin, who was working at UC, was at the same time, he was a rival to Salk, and he had developed a different poliovirus vaccine that used what's called an attenuated approach, a weakened poliovirus that was unable to cause disease in people. And this is the vaccine that I received and that probably a lot of you in the audience received. And the way you know you got it was given in a sugar pill. So usually it was a red color, you put it in a sugar pill, you would eat the sugar pill. I remember going to the doctor as a kid and hearing that I was going to get a vaccine, and I thought it was going to be a needle, and they gave me a sugar pill, and I was thrilled. And so that vaccine was used, and we can talk again in the question and answer section. It was used for many, many years, and polio was very close to being eradicated, but unfortunately, and strangely enough, as a consequence of Osama bin Laden, polio may continue for a while. And again, we can talk about that in the question and answer if anyone's interested in that. Vaccines continue today. They're probably best known. The best known example of a kind of hot vaccine prior to COVID-19 was Gardasil, which was approved to eliminate human papillomavirus infection. And papillomaviruses are the cause of cervical cancer, a number of oral cancers, anal cancers, and so forth. And it's actually the second example of a cancer that can be eliminated with a vaccine. In a weird irony, and I talk about this in the book, the first cancer, or the vaccine preventable cancer, killed the scientist who was responsible for making the technology that led to the HPV vaccine. So it was a very tragic and a true case of irony. Now, unfortunately, up to the end of 2019, vaccines had really fallen out of favor in the pharmaceutical industry. And one of the things that I do at WashU is to track the sources of innovation that are responsible for different medicines and vaccines. And what we found is that there's been almost a complete halt in the number of diseases that can be prevented with vaccines since about the 1990s. And to make a long story short, this is because the pharmaceutical industry has not regarded vaccines as being a particularly lucrative investment. And so they've looked at other things. Now, at the same time this has occurred, there's been a growing anti-vaccine movement. And as we talked about, anti-vaccines movements have been around since before vaccines, but it's important to put this into perspective that we looked at vaccines that have been withdrawn from the market. And what we found surprised us. Over 50 vaccines have been withdrawn from the market if you look historically. Most of these are because it was replaced by a better vaccine. So that's what the obsolescence stands for. Only 2 vaccines were withdrawn from the market due to being toxic. And one of these, the claim is it wasn't toxic, but I actually decided that it was probably due to toxicity. The company claimed it wasn't, probably to avoid lawsuits. And if you were wondering, that was the vaccine for, and I always mess it up, for Lyme disease. And the irony there is that I lived when I was at Yale in the city next to Lyme, Connecticut, and I can never remember the name of Lyme, which Lyme disease, if you're not familiar, started in Lyme, Connecticut, or East Lyme, Connecticut. So vaccine withdrawals due to toxicity is very, very rare. But despite that, there has been a consistent and growing anti-vaccine movement. And frankly, every generation has had a vaccine that's been claimed to cause harm. A generation ago, in the 1970s and 80s, the claim was that it was the DPT vaccine. This generation, it's the measles, mumps, and rubella, or the MMR vaccine. And this particular MMR vaccine denial was triggered, it turns out, by this guy, who is a British doctor by the name of Andrew Wakefield, who faked all of his data. And if you're interested in it, there's a gentleman by the name of Brian Deere, who's an investigative reporter from England, who researched this story, and basically he was in the British version of 60 Minutes, and he revealed that this was a complete fraud and that Wakefield was doing this just to make money, which is tragic. And it's tragic because a lot of people still today continue to believe him. And there's been a lot of resistance to vaccine that has been growing. There tend to be two types of anti-vax proponents, and they are on the two extremes of the political spectrum. They tend to be the far right, that are associated with the assumption that the government can't do things right and that there's a conspiracy going on, and the far left, which actually tends to share that view. And so the extreme versions of both political parties and both political sides happens to be anti-vax and share that one thing. So the anti-vax movement has become such a problem that the estimates are that in some states, like for example, Oregon and parts of California, greater than 30% of the population doesn't have their kids immunized for DPT or MMR, and MMR in particular, fearing this link to autism, which again, and I can tell you, having looked into it from a skeptic side on both sides, there is no data other than the falsified data, and it was actively falsified. It wasn't, he got lucky and picked patients. He actually, the results didn't turn out the way he wanted, so he made them up, he being Andrew Wakefield, to make this link between MMR and autism, which didn't actually exist. So very briefly, talking about the context of today, we're obviously facing a resurgence of an infectious disease. And this is obviously coronaviruses. We've been dealing with coronaviruses for millennia. There are 7 known coronaviruses. 4 of them cause the common cold. We can get those coronaviruses year after year. 2 of them are a bit different and incredibly scary. The first is SARS, which if you remember 2003, SARS was scary in part because it had a case fatality rate of 11%. What's that mean? 774 of the 8,000 or so people that were infected with SARS died. A high percentage. To put that in perspective, COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2, which is the name of the virus, is probably going to end up in the range of 1 to 2%. An even scarier virus is something called Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, or MERS, and it has a case fatality rate in excess of 1/3 of all people that are infected. Thankfully, again, far exceeds what we're dealing with now, but not to minimize what we're going through now. So when we look at how has the academic community, how has the government, how has industry responded to this in terms of making a vaccine, we've had to rely upon what I refer to as whiz-bang technologies, which are new technologies, most of which are still under patent, and technologies, frankly, that were developed first for oncology with really no intention to be used against infectious diseases, or with little use or little planning for that. And so this falls into 3 categories. Many of us are probably all experts on this already. One is mRNA vaccines. And here in the United States, 2 of our vaccines, those from BioNTech, which is the Pfizer partner, and Moderna are both mRNA vaccines. Then there is the use of viruses, a innocuous virus that doesn't cause a disease in people. You use that to deliver one molecule, one protein, which is called the spike protein, from SARS-CoV-2, you introduce that into the body, and those vaccines were being developed by Johnson & Johnson, Merck, and AstraZeneca. And Johnson & Johnson's vaccine has been proven to be safe and effective, and so that worked well. The Merck vaccine has an X over it because it just didn't, it failed. It was not as effective as it needed to be. And the AstraZeneca symbol there is shown in yellow because there's a lot of reason to be cautious about AstraZeneca, and I'm happy to talk about that in the question and answer session. And then a third approach is to take that spike protein, rather than encoding it in viruses or in what's known as mRNA and allowing the body to produce that protein itself, you can just give the protein that's been purified from usually it's from a bacterium. And that recombinant protein vaccine, we haven't yet seen a lot of the data for these, but Novavax, Sanofi, and GlaxoSmithKline all have vaccines, and we're waiting to see how good those particular vaccines will be. It might be that they never see the light of day because the BioNTech, Moderna, and J&J vaccines have been working so well. So if you look back historically, what you can see is, and look at the time scale from this figure that I stole from the journal Nature, that the time from which a pathogen was identified, a virus was identified, until when a vaccine was licensed, began to be used in the United States, that time period could generally be measured at least in many decades, 40, 50, 60 years, and sometimes hundreds of years. And in other cases, we still don't have a vaccine. That contrasts with the timeline for, this just happens to be the Moderna vaccine, where on January 13th was on December 31st was the first report of COVID-19, December 31st, 2019. 14 days later, we had sequenced and identified the virus. By March, the very first patient had been enrolled in the very first clinical trial. It's astonishing how quickly this has occurred. And we frankly got very, very lucky. We needed that luck, but we got very, very lucky because we have an amazingly safe and amazingly effective vaccine given the time. Now, this is the slide I put together in the autumn of last year in anticipation of what's likely to go wrong when we're rolling out these vaccines. And I'm leaving it here largely untouched, simply I think I changed the colors. It looks like it's Ohio State's colors, which is my alma mater, but largely untouched to demonstrate that we knew that the logistics behind these vaccines were going to be challenging, in part because it's a very cold vaccine, and in part because there are key questions about who gets to get immunized first and why, who gets immunized last and why, and are people going to try to jump to the front of the line? And sadly, this slide, which we won't go into detail on, turned out to be a little more prescient than I was hoping. But I look to the future very optimistically, because I think that we now have, through the existing vaccines, the ability to finally end this pandemic. But perhaps more importantly, we've identified and remembered again the scourge of infectious diseases. And there will be other viruses. Pandemics, frankly, occur every decade or two. They're a natural phenomena. They're usually associated with influenza, but clearly not always. And so maybe we will renew our emphasis in taking infectious diseases very seriously. And that's a hope of mine, so that we'll start addressing questions like the need for more vaccines, for antibiotics to address resistant strains, and so forth. So with that, I'll basically wrap up, and I would love to take questions for as long or as many questions as you all have.
Well, thank you. That was very, very fascinating talk. And I think we definitely do have some questions here.
I'll
So
stop.
the first one we have is, Kaylee says, I'm interested in learning what you meant by mentioning Osama bin Laden.
So it turns out, if you remember how they discovered Osama bin Laden, the polio has been eradicated in almost every part of the world. The exception are some villages in northern Pakistan and Afghanistan. And so what happened was that a volunteer who was ostensibly supposed to be representing a polio warden, someone who's making sure that the people in your household have been immunized for polio, knocked on the door of this complex and that person turned out to have been a CIA agent, or actually it was an agent of an agency, and so from an intelligence agency. And they basically found out that there were more people in that house than were supposed to be in that house. They deduced that it was bin Laden. The raid against bin Laden occurred, and the consequence was that the Pakistan government and parts of the Afghan government have said, we're not going to be immunizing anyone else against polio. And polio has sadly taken back off again. The hopes are that we can keep it regionally localized, and then in a few years resume the vaccination campaign so that we can hopefully eliminate polio from the planet once and for all.
Okay, and another question, why should we be cautious of AstraZeneca?
Unfortunately, if you go to the news, you can hear me quoted more than I would care to have been. AstraZeneca is the example from my mind, and I'll be quite honest, I'm incredibly frustrated with AstraZeneca. I'll go beyond rational reason and into emotion at times. And the reason for that is that what we need to fear right now, most importantly, beyond just COVID-19 itself, is an anti-vaccine movement that prevents us from hitting what's known as herd immunity. Herd immunity, in a nutshell, is the concept that if I'm a susceptible individual, let's say I'm a cancer patient, who doesn't have a functioning immune system. Even if I've been vaccinated, I don't have a functioning immune system enough to keep me protected from COVID-19. If I'm that person, herd immunity kicks in when the likelihood that I'm going to bump into someone that could infect me reaches zero. That's the real boots on the ground definition of herd immunity. We need to be nervous because it turns out that to reach herd immunity with this particular virus, we need to hit 80% to 90% of the population being immunized. There is enough anti-vaccine skepticism and enough anti-vaxxers out there that we don't need to give them ammunition to justify their position. I don't think their position is justifiable based on the data, and I'm a scientist, so I'm trained to just look at data. But we don't need to give them that ammunition. And my frustration with AstraZeneca is that AstraZeneca has done everything wrong from the beginning that they could possibly do. They couldn't have engineered a worse outcome than they did. It started, if you recall, last summer and autumn when the AstraZeneca vaccine trials were suspended in the United States for a few months. The FDA saw something that concerned them enough to say, in the midst of when we didn't know if we were going to have any vaccine, they took one of the leading vaccines out of the competition, saying that there were concerns about safety. AstraZeneca never clarified what that was about, and that was a mistake. And that was you could argue that that was simply a propaganda mistake. They weren't good in their communications. Well, later, when they finally released data, it wasn't on their safety, but when they released data, they being AstraZeneca, they fudged the results. And they said, well, we had two different populations. Our main population was protected by X amount, which was something like 64%. And we had another population that was protected by 70-something%. But what they didn't say until they were called on it 2 or 3 days later is that they had messed up the clinical study, given the wrong amount of vaccine. And it turns out that the wrong amount of vaccine, which was given to just some of the study participants, but not others, the wrong amount worked better than the right amount. And they didn't own up to that. So that was strike 2. And then strike 3 was what happened earlier this week when they reported data that the NIH, which is not a regulatory body, it's purely a science body, the NIH, or more specifically the NIAID, the National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, probably best known for its leader, who's Tony Fauci. Tony's group said that the numbers they're reporting are wrong. They're not the same numbers that we have and the same numbers that AstraZeneca has. They were reporting, again, they were cherry picking the results that they were showing. So add all of those things up, and this is independent of some of the other shenanigans that have gone on in Europe. And there have been some things that have gone on in Europe. There was a raid on a warehouse earlier this week in which the Italian government had been told there were no vaccines in Italy. AstraZeneca was hiding 8 million vaccine units in Italy. There are a lot of things that AstraZeneca they've done that have undermined the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is we have 3 fantastic vaccines right now in the Moderna, the Pfizer, and the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. They are amazingly safe. Yes, there are a handful, I think less than a dozen cases of side effects. Thankfully, no fatalities. They're manageable side effects. They tend to be allergic side effects by people that are prone to having what's known as anaphylaxis, but they're also amazingly effective. The key to understand, and the Johnson & Johnson vaccine has come under assault recently as well for not being as good or perceived as being as good, but it's an apples and orange comparison. And the key number is that everyone who's received any of those 3 vaccines, including the Johnson & Johnson, did not ever require hospitalization and did not pass away. And so those are the really top level numbers. They might have gotten a disease, but it was a very minor disease, whereas it otherwise might have been a more lethal disease. So AstraZeneca runs the risk of giving the anti-vaxxers the ammunition that they crave.
That's really interesting and very scary.
Well, it's sad. And we have to remember that, and I interact a lot with reporters, and there are a lot of salacious stories that I've said to them, look, this is a story that doesn't, anything that detracts from the vaccines is going to add to this anti-vaccine skepticism. I would never recommend to hide anything, but I always say to them, put it into perspective. And if there's ever a toxicity issue, we need to be 100% transparent about a toxicity issue. If there's a lack of efficacy issue or a variant that arises that's going to resist the vaccine, the public needs to know about that the moment that the scientific community knows about that. But other things like, for example, I was mentioning this warehouse full of a vaccine that the company seems to have been hiding. That kind of stuff is not linked to the science or the safety or the efficacy of vaccines. It's just salacious.
Very interesting. So this is the question that I can answer. It's, does your book cover COVID-19? And of course, your book came out in 2018, so we know that it does not. But related to that, I'm curious to know, since COVID hadn't happened yet, or the pandemic hadn't happened yet, what motivated you to write this book in the first place?
Well, so the key motivation was a bit twofold. One was that the anti-vaccine movement had been growing steadily. And again, specifically the anti-vaccine movement that was focused that the MMR vaccine was causing autism. And what triggered it was the fear that when we were reaching numbers, and I believe in Ohio at one point, it was down to 70% of children in school-age children were being vaccinated. And I think that was in like 2014. And when you see those kind of numbers, that's scary, because measles, I was mentioning this herd immunity idea. The herd immunity rate for measles is 90%. If you fall below 90%, you now have an epidemic in your community. And we've seen epidemics. We saw an epidemic, I believe, at Ohio University. We saw an epidemic at University of Illinois, Champaign. We've seen them at Yale. We've seen them at Harvard. And we're getting relapses, if you will, epidemics of measles, of mumps, and of rubella in college-age students. And again, the older you are when you come down with these childhood diseases, the worse the disease is. And so, and we've forgotten that measles is also incredibly deadly for young kids. And I was hearing stories about measles parties, where one kid would be known to have measles, and they'd invite the mothers and fathers would invite all the other children to come over so that they could get naturally infected, with the assumption that natural infection is a good thing. Well, if you look at history of infectious diseases, natural infection is why people die. It's not a good thing. And so that was my main motivation for doing this.
It's really interesting. So the next question, I'm hearing a lot about the shortage of vaccines in some parts of the world. How will we ever get COVID under control if much of the world's population has no way to get the vaccine?
That's a absolutely fantastic question. This pandemic does not end until we have hit herd immunity in every community across the planet. And the reason why I say that is that, and we've already seen examples of this, and that is that viruses mutate. They actually mutate really, really well, and they propagate unbelievably fast. Put those two things together and you get the rise of variants. And we've heard the term variant, but a variant is basically good old-fashioned Darwinian evolution, in which you get a virus that either can grow faster or resist treatment or resist vaccination. The good news is that as of today, as of late March 2021, all of the variants we've identified so far respond still to the vaccine. So people that are vaccinated should be resistant to the variants. The bad news is that the more that the virus is allowed to circulate, the efficacy that we have, which currently is about 95%. And to give you some perspective, the FDA said we will accept efficacy for an approval, an emergency use authorization. We will accept an efficacy of 50%. Well, we got 95%, which is amazing. And we got 95% with 3 different vaccines. With the variants, the 95% might become 90, and might become 85, and it might become 80, and it's going to eventually wear us down until the point where we're either going to need to get a new boost or this disease comes back. And you've probably already heard that companies are working on a booster right now so that they can address these variants. But until we have everyone around the planet immunized, we're playing what I had an op-ed that I published a couple of weeks ago called the COVID-19 whack-a-mole game. And we have an arcade strategy of whack-a-mole where we're going to hit this vaccine and this other variant over here is going to pop up. And we're just going to have to keep doing this until we can convince everybody to become vaccinated. Right now, it's a supply issue. There's not enough supply for demand. But hopefully within the next year or so globally, and within the next 2 to 3 months in the US, supply is not going to be the issue. I can promise you, sadly, I can promise you that come June, July, August, we are going to start hearing more and more stories about anti-vax resistance. And the thing that I think everyone needs to realize is that if your neighbor doesn't get vaccinated, you may not have herd immunity. We all have to do this, and you need to get vaccinated, not just to protect yourself, but to protect your community. And when I say community, I'm talking parents, children, siblings, but I'm also talking next door neighbors, the people that you might see in the grocery store and so forth. And some people will say, well, it's my right not to be vaccinated, but this gets into questions about mandates and other things, which is it your right to infect someone else? And those are, I think, going to be some of the really hard conversations. And I, as a scientist, cannot make that decision and won't make that decision, thankfully. But we as a democracy need to be thinking about this. How do we address these kind of issues before they happen rather than waiting until they happen?
That's really concerning. And, you talked earlier about, people like, say, people who have cancer, other compromising conditions where even if they get the vaccine, it might not be as effective with them. So is it safe to say that really everybody who's an adult and a child who's healthy, like 100% of us need to get this vaccine or a vaccine in order to get rid of this thing?
Yes. So if you do the math, if we need 80% of people to be protected through vaccination, what that really means is we need almost 100, because we are going to have people that are naturally, who may be vaccinated, but they aren't going to be protected. And that includes the elderly. Again, anyone who's on cancer patients, or anyone who's a cancer patient, anyone who is on drugs such for rheumatoid arthritis or MS or lupus, any kind of autoimmune disease drugs, and you hear 4 or 5 of these being advertised per hour on TV. They're all over the place. Those individuals may not be able to mount as good of a protection. Would I recommend that they get vaccinated? Absolutely. Even though their protection might not be 100%, it's still going to be better than if they're unvaccinated. But those are the people we need to care about as a society. And so a person who is perfectly healthy rejecting vaccines is endangering someone who maybe live next to them. My mouth is stopped working. They may be endangering the person who lives next door to them who's taking Enbrel. And I'm not trying to pick on Enbrel, but Enbrel is a very commonly used drug for rheumatoid arthritis and other things. It might make someone who's been vaccinated, it may make that vaccination not work quite as well. So we need to be thinking about them and caring about them as part of the community. And that's where, again, we need to think about this on a population basis.
Okay, so we have some more questions about the variants.
Yep.
People are asking about, how effective current vaccines are, which you did talk about a little bit, and how much concern is there about the possible continuation of the spread of the viruses despite the vaccines? And also, I'm going to lump this together. Is it justified to think that one approved vaccine is better than another?
Okay, I'll try to remember them. One of them's really easy. We got very lucky. All 3 of the vaccines that have been approved to date, they are all comparable. The Johnson & Johnson clinical trial used a different set of criteria than AstraZeneca and Pfizer did. And so their numbers didn't look as impressive at first glance, but it turns out that was due to how the trial was set up. When you look at the key number, which is severe disease and death, it was 100% protection. So if anyone offered me, my family, I have a mother who lives in Southwest Ohio who recently got, I think, the J&J vaccine. My wife works at Pfizer. She'll get the Pfizer vaccine. And I was a volunteer on the clinical trial for Moderna. So, and when people say, I volunteered in June to get one of the experimental vaccines because I figured I need to put my money where my mouth is. And if I'm going to advocate for vaccines, which I knew I would, then I need to say, yes, I would be willing to take something, even if it's experimental. And it turns out by pure luck, I ended up in the Moderna vaccine. For the record, I ended up getting saline. I was part of the control group, but then they came back and vaccinated us. But I'll be giving blood samples for the next 2 years, and they'll be monitoring me very, very closely to make sure that there are no toxicity issues. Because one of the things about those of us who volunteered, and if you're in the audience and you volunteered, thank you. But those of us who volunteered are the canaries in the coal mine. If there are going to be toxicity issues, we are going to show it first. So for many reasons, I track this very, very closely. And to my knowledge, there are no concerns about toxicity. So that's one question. All the vaccines are comparable to one another. The variants, the question there is that we are not seeing any erosion yet of efficacy against the variants, except, and this is going to sound like I'm picking on them, but I'm not, except for the AstraZeneca vaccine. Because the AstraZeneca vaccine was tested in South Africa and it didn't seem to work, and to the point where the South African government stopped giving it out. Interestingly enough, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine was also tested in South Africa, and it showed good efficacy against the what's called the South African variant. And there is a variant in South Africa and one in Brazil that makes us the most nervous. And we know that all three of the vaccines that have been approved in the United States work well. If I were presented with the AstraZeneca vaccine, I'm not entirely certain I would take it. And I'm as pro-vaccine as they get. I'm not entirely sure I would take it. Not because it's unsafe, but because I'm not entirely sure that it's going to work. It may give partial protection, and if it's that or nothing, I would take that. But whereas in the United States, we have a choice, and we have a choice of 3 outstanding vaccines. If we do see erosion of the vaccine, it's not going to be a sudden drop. It's going to be, again, this very slow eating away. And what that means is that probably if we look at the rates that we're seeing now, that probably in about 2 to 3 years, you'll see a booster that will be needed. And we'll do that prophylactically before we really, really need it, so that we have a return to where we are today in lockdown and all. And so we'll likely see a booster now, and my guess would be, and this is a pure guess, probably every 5 or 6 years. But if we hit herd immunity, if everyone gets vaccinated, we will decrease the mutation rate, and therefore will decrease the rise of new variants in the future. And so we can put this fully behind us eventually.
Okay, I have another question for you. Can microbiome critters be used as vaccines? Is there any research on this?
Not to my knowledge. The microbiome is an incredibly fascinating subject. I love it. It was actually discovered at WashU by a guy that, when I am at work, is a couple buildings over. Really nice guy by the name of Jeff Gordon, and no, he's not also a NASCAR driver. But no, I think that probably the reason why I would say you probably don't want to do that is the thing about the microbiome is that it's in your body, hopefully forever. And you really don't want to do something like a vaccination. You don't want to have that always around, because there's always a concern if you're being constantly assaulted by something that you'll undergo what's known to an immunologist like myself as tolerance, where suddenly actually you'll turn the immune system off rather than making it work. And again, without beating up too much on AstraZeneca, one interpretation of the data that they have released is that they might have a risk of inducing tolerance, which is again one of the reasons why I'm not a huge fan of the AZ vaccine. Their science just isn't there.
Okay, Anne would like to know, what do you think is the best way to convince anti-vaxxers that it's okay?
It's, I think, being 100% transparent. That means the anti-vaxxers aren't just born to be evil and say, I'm not going to take a vaccine. They're scared of something, or they're suspicious about something, or they're questioning something. And so I think what we need to do is to have the conversations and address their questions. And hopefully forums like this, I kind of hope there are some people that are anti-vax. And it's always good to question things. I'm a scientist. That's the definition of being a scientist. You have to question everything. So I understand that. I think the key question that I have, or the main thing I would point out, is that when you're getting answers to those questions, look at objective data. Don't look at biased data. When I was writing this book and then after, if you go on Twitter or Facebook or any social media and you type in the word vaccine, when I did this last, which was it was right before COVID occurred, 95% of the hits were anti-vax, and they are very sophisticated. I could go on for hours about this, and you really don't want me to, but let me just kind of summarize it with this. It turns out there was an investigation that was done that showed that Russian troll farms, the same Russian troll farms that have been interfering with elections for the last 4 or 5, 10 years, are responsible for the vast majority, greater than 99% of the anti-vaccine messaging on Twitter and on Facebook. And and people would ask, well, why in the heck would they do that? The goal of these Russian troll farms is to undermine confidence in government and to undermine confidence in accepted structures. And so that's what they get out of it. Because if they undermine, if Americans start to question their government or Europeans start questioning their government, then that allows the Russians to do other things. So again, I don't mean to sort of stereotype any group, but I can tell you that the Russian government is behind most of these anti-vax movements, messages, and they have a motivation, and frankly, they're winning. A lot of these anti-vax messaging, it's very sophisticated. It looks really good, and it's drawing upon data that's completely bogus. That's the frustration.
Another scary thing you're telling us.
Sorry.
Okay, we have another question here. During this pandemic, we've seen a lot of resistance to wearing masks, social distancing, and taking other precautions. Historically, were people more willing to listen to scientists? And how do you think we can change that issue?
Two things. One is that if you look at it, fear drives these kind of things. There's something, that's why my book was actually called Between Hope and Fear. When you talk about pandemics and any kind of infectious disease and the measures against them, like vaccines, we're always between hope and fear. As far as the specific question of, is it worse now? People need to realize, and this is kind of the advantage I have of being a scientist and someone who is completely addicted to history. Anti-science movements and anti-science concerns have always been around. They've been around for as long as there's been science. We happen to be right now in a period that is particularly anti-science. Science is portrayed very, very negatively. It's the last time we were in this situation was in the early 1970s, where with the rise of recombinant DNA technologies, what's known as the biotech revolution. The biotech revolution was ground to a halt. I talk about this in my first book, which is called A Prescription for Change. We delayed, we being the scientific community, delayed for 2 years all of the research that was being done in biotechnology because there were fears about, could we create the Andromeda strain? And as a matter of fact, the Andromeda strain was based on the fear. Michael Crichton had heard about this fear, and he basically built it into a book that scared even more people. And so we go through these periods, they're natural. We happen to be in a really bad period. What's fascinating to me is when you look at what breaks these anti-science periods, it's generally an epidemic. So HIV/AIDS probably was the reason why that anti-science period in the 70s ended, because we realized all of a sudden in the 80s, we need to return to scientists and doctors to get out of this, because the AIDS global epidemic was a disaster. Perhaps this particular outbreak will, again, one of the bright sides could be that we renew our trust in science and scientists. As a scientist, never trust any data. Always question it, but go to legitimate sources when you question it, not my neighbor's cousin said. That's dangerous.
Okay, and we're just about the end here. I'm going to ask you one more question. Leah and Ted want to know, are we in consultation with other countries to develop and or improve vaccines?
Yes, that has been one of the great positives, is that this has been truly an international movement. Some countries have been more open than others. Some have heard criticisms of China. They were very open in the beginning, and then they weren't so much later. But the other part of it is that the US and European companies and US and European scientists and governments have worked in lockstep together.
And that's good news for all of us.
That's very good news. It's why we were able to achieve what we were in such a short period of time.
Makes sense. All right, well, I think we're about out of time for tonight. We got most of the questions answered. I want to thank you, Michael Kinch, for being with us tonight. It's a fascinating subject, and I know we all learned a lot. And thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. And don't forget to check our website for more upcoming wonderful programs.